Exactly what differences does it make whether we draw a scene in 15 minutes or in 45 minutes? How does that different time affect our observation, our line work, the detail we draw, and other choices that we're forced to make? I thought I'd put it to the test with this scene in Paris, a scene of great fondness for me, as it was one of my very first urban sketching experiences some years ago. But let me try again, this time freehand directly in ink, giving myself a 15-minute time limit and then a 45-minute time limit, and then we'll compare the two and just see how time can affect how we draw and perhaps some of the advantages and disadvantages of both. I discovered 15 minutes is a really quick time to try and complete a drawing. The most obvious thing to me was simply how fast I had to draw, how quickly I had to draw the lines. And there really wasn't nearly as much time to be as exact as I like to be and to observe as carefully as I normally do. So right from the start, it was more about trying to capture the effect of the buildings, the sense of these are buildings, than to really be drawing an accurate architectural depiction of them. So I was really just trying to capture the windows and the balcony rails. It's really important still to get the perspective angles correct, even in a very fast sketch. That's probably the detail that I would say is most important to spend some time on, is to get those angles as correct as we can, because then the building will generally look correct, even if some of the other details are missing or changed or a bit on the wobbly side. The main bones of the building, if you like, will seem right. So I realized I didn't fit enough windows in on this building on the left hand side, but there wasn't anything I could do about that at this point. I didn't get these perspective angles higher up as angled as they should be. They're a bit shallow, which doesn't look real obvious, but it just makes the drawing not quite as dramatic as it could have been. So I add these details on top. And I'm looking at my time and it's about half over at this point. But I take heart from the fact that drawings are always slower in the first half because you're still getting a sense of the scene and of the scale. So I'm going pretty fast now for this drawing, which is further away, which means we can draw it with less detail, but it actually has more detail architecturally than the one I've just drawn. So it's a bit tricky to know exactly what to do. It's also important to reserve the space for the tree so I don't have straight lines going into the tree canopy. So that's just something you need to pay attention to whenever there are trees happening. There's a bit of a pattern in the brickwork with the red and the cream bricks, and I try to give some hint of that, but of course I don't have time to be very precise at all. And then these little dormer windows on the top, and probably what was once the servants' quarters right on the top. The most complex part of this scene is at street level, and that makes it quite challenging in a very fast drawing because I really have to be gestural and there isn't time to observe the detail, let alone to draw it. So I add a few generic figures and generally just try and do a little bit of quick hatching to represent darker shadows behind shop fronts and that sort of thing. With the foliage on this tree, I'm only going to just barest attempt with it. I'm really just outlining the leaves and trying to give a strong sense of these are trees here. And then there really isn't time to do much in the foreground. I leave out these garbage receptacles and there really isn't time to do any hatching. So I'm feeling pretty frantic at this point because my time is just about up. I quickly try and put a few lines in the foreground so it doesn't look quite as bare. And then, well, that's pretty much it. But it's a nice brisk style and I do quite like it. What now will be the difference taking 45 minutes, taking 3 times as long to draw the same scene? I'm actually drawing this the next day. So the memory of that really quick, painfully quick 15-minute sketch is still very strong in my mind and in my hand. But the main difference I hit straight away is that I can take a little more time with my line work. So my lines generally are heavier because there's actually time now for the ink to flow onto the paper, and that's nice. I've also got time to work a little harder at the perspective angles, and I've also got the memory that my upper perspective angles in the really quick sketch yesterday didn't quite go steep enough as they got near the top of the scene. The other thing that's strong in my memory is that I didn't do the foreshortening accurately enough on the building on the left-hand side here. And the impact that meant was that it didn't look like the building went as far down the street as it really does. It flattened the depth of plane of the scene. And so I'm determined to make more effort to narrow the windows as they move along, and actually to put all the windows in and not just some of them, as I did yesterday. In some ways it is quicker because I do have the memory of yesterday's drawing. I do have a lot of the observation and the things I noticed already in my head. And so that is a help. And I've also got a firmer idea of simply what line technique I'm going to use to represent some of these things here. So I follow basically the same pattern I followed with the quick sketch in terms of the order that I drew. I draw the left-hand side first. I take care along the bottom where the building hits the road to not do a straight line, and I hope you can see the impact that has and the flexibility it gives you to be a lot more accurate when we have figures and objects in front of the base of the building, and also the fact that even if there is nothing obstructing the view of the base of the building, very rarely do we have a neat straight line where the building hits the road. So keeping that open for the detail that's often there is a really great thing to do. So I go, as I did yesterday, right up here, and I do these bollards, and I actually do a better job with the foreshortening. I don't put as many in, and I also then start to do the other figures at the far end. I do a better job today with scale. I think, again, as I've got more time to look and to compare with my reference before I put the pen on the paper. So my figures in this drawing relate better size-wise to each other, and then also better to the buildings that they're in front of. Now I've got this building at the end of the street, and I've got the benefit of the way I worked out to do the patterned stonework yesterday, except I've got the advantage of more time to do it. But similarly to yesterday, I spent a fair bit of time trying to get the perspective angles correct, because that's still the most important thing in architecture, I think, for the buildings overall to look right. And again, I need to reserve the trees, the space for the leaf canopy in front of the building. One of the big differences in today's drawing, I'm presuming at this point, is going to be I'll have significantly more time to do the leaf texture. And in fact, I did. I probably spent almost a third of the time doing the tree in this drawing. But I've got more time to do the detail on this building a little more accurately, and I enjoyed that. In fact, the danger with a building this far back in the depth is that I'll do too much detail on it, and that will tend to bring it forward. I still want it to sit further back. And I've got this street level detail now, and this is one of the more fiddly sections, and where I'm looking back and forth and trying to work out how I can simplify it but still give the sense of all the fuss of the people and the architecture that's actually at ground level. So now I've got this upper section of this building on the right hand side. So I do that, and this is where I make one of the mistakes. I've just put that section on, and I've put a second section on before I put the chimneys on, and there should only be one, which really annoys me because it does change the proportions of the building. And because I know this building well from this scene, and I did sit here and do a location sketch on a trip to Paris some years ago, it annoys me that it makes the building, to me, not look right. And now I'm working on a little more detail than I had time for in the 15-minute sketch. I can take more care with these bollards. I decide I'm going to put these street garbage bags in, because there was a bit of a gap there, I felt. And while they're not the most attractive things, they end up not being something that the eye falls on. The line work of the buildings are still the major attention grabbers. So I think it just fills in an empty spot without looking as unsightly as possibly it does in the photo. I need to try and get a sense of these further back details at street level, and there are some arches as well that I'll need to put in. And then I'm thinking about the trees now and just exactly how I'm going to work the foliage there. I put the trunks in really before I work too much on the trees, because this is not all one tree, and I'm wanting to try and create the effect in my drawing that there is in the photo, which is that these leaves up the top are larger because they're closer, and that as we move down the leaf on the right hand side, the leaves become smaller because the trees that they're on are further back. So this is one of the things where it can be easy to miss this detail in the photo, because photos take away the sense of depth. So not all leaves are on the same tree, even when it's the same type of tree. So whether I achieve that or not, I don't know, but there is always a bit of a tangle of lines with foliage in a fast drawing. So now there is really a minute or two doing these leaves. The edges of canopies, the silhouette of the leaves is always very important, and particularly if we want to suggest the scale of the tree, that is how far away it is. If it's too far away to see an actual leaf, then we don't want to do it. Then we don't want to draw leaf shapes that suggest this is a leaf, because then we change the scale. I just realized that I hadn't done those little dormer windows up the top there, and I decided to do a little bit more on the right hand side of this downpipe on the left hand buildings. Now I had a quick look at my drawing and I thought, oh yes, these angles flatten out a little bit, which means that the street frontage curves a bit, but I flattened it too much, and then it looked silly. So yeah, I wasn't very happy with that. I tried to adjust it, but it was probably a bit careless, particularly for this late in the drawing. I was starting to feel a bit nervous with the time. If I compare my 15-minute drawing with the reference, I think the main issues were not enough foreshortening happened here, as there is in life, which made this row of buildings feel like they ended sooner instead of continuing to go down the street. I also didn't get the foreshortening here accurate enough, and that can be seen because this building spreads across too widely. This actually is quite a narrow space that we see because of the angle of the building. I felt the drawing was a bit empty down here. There just wasn't time to add any more line work. And I did feel that this foliage, while it was probably just adequate for the time there was, does help add to this empty space. But I did feel I captured something of the scene. With the 45-minute drawing, although it wasn't intentional, I did actually draw it larger than the original. I think I did a better job of getting the foreshortening here so that this building feels like it continues along the street further, and I also foreshortened this building more tightly, also to better reflect the angle that it crosses our field of vision. Now, I was very annoyed that this unnecessary addition was put on to the top of the building. Dropping this by that much would create a nicer composition. I had a little more time to work on line work in this lower section of the drawing, particularly in this street, to give a bit of line work so it's not such an empty space, but also trying to create something of the effect of the foreshortening of the pavers that are there. There was a little more detail, a little more accurately drawn at the base of the trees. Probably the only thing I'm particularly unhappy about in this drawing is this last minute section that I did. I was feeling a bit rushed. I hadn't noticed that I hadn't done it, and I had intended that I would. And it meant I simply didn't observe as accurately as I normally do. And I therefore didn't draw as accurately as I hope I usually do. Which to me emphasizes yet again that the most important thing is that we look carefully before we start to draw. Let's look at the two drawings side by side. The most obvious thing is simply how much heavier these lines are drawn with the same pen, let me say a 0.3mm pen, because I didn't have to move the pen as quickly and it simply allowed more time for the ink to flow. A lot of the details here are much more gestural. Some of them that works, I think it works quite well for the trees, but I think this figure doesn't work as well as one that just took a little bit more time. I remembered yesterday how I originally positioned this line here and how I had to correct that so I didn't make that mistake this time. So 15 minutes versus 45 minutes. They're both still relatively quick sketches, but there's a whole lot more I can do in 45 minutes than I can do in 15. And it's a helpful thing to have a sense of what can I achieve for the time I have available, because then I can pace myself well and I can also adapt my line work for the time I have. And so I don't end up with a drawing where half the drawing looks like this and the other half looks like this, simply because I ran out of time to pace my line work and the amount of detail I drew consistently. It's a lot of fun to draw the same scene more than once, but to give ourselves a rigid time to draw it in. If you haven't seen it, I have a 15-minute video in real time of drawing this. And this reference scene is available on my community page if you want to have a go drawing it in 15 minutes or 45 minutes or 2 hours. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.